Soccerex Connected, a very good evening from our HQ here in London. Brand new digital studio. Ben Jacobs with you for the evening session. We're going to move on in a moment to heritage, more details and panel introductions to come. But you have a warning, 1 hour to go to enter our competition to win a signed shirt with our presenting partner today, Teamworks. In terms of which shirt, well, you get to pick. There's a vast array here at our headquarters, including Laurie Lindsay, US Women's National Team. We've got Deco, and in addition to that, Louis Saha, a white away Manchester United jersey. Quite a few as well. The winner each day gets to pick, and what's left spills over to the next day. And because Teamworks are presenting, we're asking you which two players just work well together. And you've got three options. First of all, current teammates. Second of all, historical players that maybe played for the club but at different times that you think might make hypothetically good teammates, or just go totally fictional and pick two football don't play together but you think might make good teammates. Naturally, we've had Messi and Ronaldo, but I disagree. I don't think they would gel. Well, Kane and Son is the most popular one. Shearer and Sutton from the Rovers days, thanks to Oscar King, who also says there's never been a more iconic duo than in the film Goal, Santiago Munez and his cardboard shin pads. And I'm going to watch that film tonight and confirm whether I think that is or isn't a good duo. But thanks for having a bit of fun with us. So at Soccerex, who is your perfect partnership of teammates in association with Teamworks to stand a chance of winning that signed shirt? Please do engage with the app as well. The exhibitors are all there, and a reminder, tomorrow gets underway at 11:30 GMT, the final day of Soccerex Connected. So let's move on to our heritage session now. We've got a great panel for you, and all week we've been using the 1930 FIFA World Cup as an in point to talk about both history and the legacy that iconic tournament has left on modern football. In today's panel, we'll be talking about history and the current state of education, management, and some of the challenges that players face whilst they're playing and after they've retired. To give you more details, we are delighted to welcome Nyall Sims, sports consultant at Sims Consultancy, Hugo Scheckter, founder and managing director of Player Care Group. Alongside both of them, Bex Smith, the Global Executive Director at Copper 90, a strategic advisor for Zone 7 and a former New Zealand international, no less, and Miriam Walker-Khan, a sports journalist for BBC Sport. And your moderator is both a journalist and more specifically the Southampton reporter. So not a good week for him. A 9-0 drubbing against Manchester United, but hopefully a smile back on his face for this panel. Daniel works for The Athletic. A very good evening to you, Daniel. Over to you. And of course, sorry for bringing up that heavy defeat by Southampton against Manchester United.
No worries, Ben. Thank you. I've not heard 9-0 in about 16 months, so I needed reminding of it. First of all, evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining me. I've got four brilliant panelists, as you've all just heard them introduced, waiting by to discuss the history and current state of education, management, and post-player careers affairs. But before getting on to kind of whose responsibility player care is and the transition in and out of football, I think it's worth getting a brief introduction from Hugo, as you mentioned, the founder and managing director of the Player Care Group, to exactly what is player care. So Hugo, if I can go straight to you for that one.
Yeah, I think player care is a pretty broad term, which kind of, for me, looks at everything that isn't football or medical at a football club. Specifically in a football environment, I think you kind of have the well-being side, which is the mental health, making sure they're happy, make sure they're settled, and then the operational bits that we also provide. So that would be, finding them a house, finding them a car, that kind of off the field relocation support, and the two of them together, mixed with team operations, mixed with team communication, team bonding. It kind of brings together all of those little bits into a wide range of topic, which is, in my mind, player care.
And when did player care first come on the horizon for you? When did you become aware of it? Is it something that is recently come into the game, or is it something that goes back to the kind of 1930s? I know James Brown, the 1930 World Cup conference, founder, his grandfather, Jim Brown, was going on strike when he was playing for Manchester United and ended up getting put in the reserves because of it, because he didn't think they were being paid enough. And that is kind of remarkable. It goes that far back. I mean, what's your kind of history on it?
I think, I can't say I was around then, so I don't have any experience of that. But, from my research and my knowledge of the game, it kind of popped up maybe about 25 years ago, where a couple of clubs, I think Aston Villa were the first to appoint someone to kind of try and look at the softer skills of football and try and make sure that their expensive signings were settling in. And that's kind of, been the model with a single player liaison in the Premier League, for a number of clubs. That's then changed. Man City and Hayden Roberts kind of pioneered player care as an actual department and that was probably about 2010. And that was, looking at it more strategically as a more rounded approach and kind of planning for it on the same level that you plan for transfers or plan for medical, or, making it into a more serious department. And definitely some Man City were doing that for the last 10 years or so. So yeah, it's really seen a massive boom in the last sort of 7 years, especially since I've been in it. And really, really fascinating to see where it's going now. And
Rebecca, if I may come to you on this one, obviously given your career as a professional footballer, what's your experience of player care? You good or bad? You must have seen a whole variety of issues.
Yes, lots of variety everywhere. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. I think it totally kind of depended on what country and what team I played for, whether it was in Sweden or Germany, Australia or New Zealand or the US. I think to Hugo's point, there wasn't like a system and there wasn't a proper sort of process that was set up in any of the clubs that I was in. And I think because player care is not commercialized, it tended to sort of be the hot potato that everyone was passing the buck to someone else because there wasn't anything to gain from it except for players' well-being, which is actually should be at the core of every club and every stakeholder in football. So I think, especially in women's football, it sort of fell a lot to individuals who cared about the players. So whether it was sometimes a team manager, or even in one club I had, it was a marketing manager in Sweden, who is still sort of my international mom because of how well she sort of helped me adjust into Sweden and that life. But it certainly is something that there's a big gap, especially in the women's game.
And who do you think is ultimately responsible for that player care? Who should that fall down to? Should that fall down to your manager, for example, or should that be someone else in the club, such as Hugo?
I think actually it's every person, every stakeholder in football, it's all of their jobs. So whether you're a club manager or whether you're FIFA or you're a confederation or a federation, and having worked at FIFA, this was something that I saw a huge gap in as well, that they didn't get down to that level of player care. And I think there should be regulations from the top down. There should be minimal standards. And if you look at how FIFPro looks to try to lobby on behalf of the players in some cases, but it shouldn't just be down to FIFPro. I think that having a stakeholder like FIFPro sometimes even negative, only because people think, well, it should fall on them. They should be responsible for it, but it shouldn't be. It should really be in the self-interest of every stakeholder in football, because if you have happy, healthy players, they're going to play better. They're going to be less injured. They're going to be on the pitch more. You can write about them. You can, see them in action as a fan. And it's just a really important thing, not to mention that they're not just products, that these people, they're humans first.
And Nyall, you've obviously got experience of kind of playing within an academy. In terms of the support from the governing bodies, did you see a lot of that back then or not?
Yeah, well, you definitely did see a lot of support from the likes of the PFA. They really did push that, you should do something alongside your training, be it a vocational course or some type of A-level. But the difficulty is that the culture around football, and when you're at the academy and, you're seen to be doing more educational work instead of, your physical training, you could be deemed as someone who wants to, perhaps do a different career. So you might not believe that you're going to be a footballer. And so what you see there is that, education kind of takes a back seat. So as much as governing bodies may push that, the need to have education and whatnot, it's down to, the players in the club to think, okay, actually, it's not going to harm me, putting full commitment into my education.
But is that mindset something that every player has, or can they be pushed on a little bit? It sounds like you've obviously, I know the work you're doing at the moment, you obviously thought you saw the bigger picture, but perhaps not everyone does. So is enough being done in that sense?
Again, enough is being done, but more can be done. I would be the first to say that. Again, it's habitus. It's inscribed within any footballer to believe that they're going to be a footballer. So the second you kind of show, actually, I'm going to do something else, I'm going to go to another course, in their mind, they think it can be a detriment to them. And what it is about now is kind of untraining that thought process and showing the players that, having I wouldn't even like to call it a backup plan, because it kind of relegates the importance of it. It's about having, a dual career. That's something that the PFA are pushing a lot. And I think, we're getting a lot of traction with that. And especially after, the COVID-19 implications, where a lot of people have had to stay at home and not play football, which they've been doing from probably about the age of 5. They've seen that there's a necessity to find other skills and, getting themselves well qualified just in case football doesn't happen for them, which is something that we've seen for the first time.
And Miriam, I know you've been doing a lot of research into this in your role at the BBC and so on. In terms of what you've been looking into, what have you found about the PF? If we use the PFA for an example, as we're all in England, what have you found about the work they're doing at kind of academy level and going on?
I mean, the PFA, yeah, they have a lot of things in place, a lot of kind of support mechanisms. So I think they have a 24/7 wellbeing helpline open to anyone who needs it. They offer counselling, residential rehab services. I think they encourage people as well, like Nyall said, to start thinking about life after football. So they even have like grants to facilitate kind of flexible learning opportunities for players. And this is great, but it just feels like no one is actually using it. And I know that they feel they have issues with kind of getting through to younger players in particularly, but it is hard, and they're doing all they can to try and cut through. But I think, if they could work a bit harder with the clubs, it feels like that's kind of the missing link, because so much of the time, especially young players who are maybe still teenagers, they don't always know when to speak out, and I think there are so many things the club could do. Like, I've spoken to some teenagers who said they had long-term injuries and they were having physical rehab, but there was nothing in terms of like mental health support alongside that to help them get through that, which to me is like a no-brainer. Like, if someone's out for 6 months injured, why not offer them the mental health support? So I think so much can be done to just like bridge that gap there.
And I think on that's a really interesting point you make, especially about the mental health element. If you're a young player in an academy, whose responsibility should that be? Should that be kind of 50-50 with the parents and the club? Should the club be providing support mechanisms that should be there in place for the youngster, or should that be, it's not our responsibility because he still lives at home with his parents? I guess it's quite a difficult one to balance. Or
yeah, I guess as well, a lot of them don't live at home. They do live on kind of campus. So I would say, for parents who maybe don't know much about the game, a lot of them maybe they don't speak the language of the people who run the clubs. Like, it is the club's responsibility ultimately. If they know how they're, how much training people are going through and how much they're maybe suffering from an injury, they should be responsible for that, in my opinion. Like, it's their responsibility basically.
And Hugo, I expect you may have a different experience with the PFA working inside a football club. What's that relationship like between a player care officer and the PFA? Is it close, strained, or?
I mean, I think what we hear a lot of in football is that someone should be doing something, and so I think the way that player care has come out from a club's point of view is clubs saying, we're going to take responsibility for this, or we're going to try and take responsibility for this and try and be proactive. And I think that's kind of where it's born out of. The PFA do a lot of good things, and I think they do a lot of things that they don't do so well. I think certainly at the Premier League level, I think they do struggle to sort of connect with the players. I think they're really good at the lower leagues, but maybe not so relevant in the Premier League at the moment. But they've got a big change of leadership coming, so it'll be interesting to see how that changes with maybe a more forward thinking and modern approach. But really, I think what I try and do, and I think Bex alludes to this, is try and put player care into a perspective of a financial one as well as a well-being one, because it's all well and good saying we need to do this because it's the right thing to do, and that will resonate with some people, but actually to show clubs that by reducing the risk of players not settling, you are showing to a club that if you spend £45 million on a player and you really do everything you can to set them into the area, they got more chance of settling and succeeding. So from a pure financial point of view, player care actually makes a lot of sense. And so you have then the financial argument and the welfare argument, which are both equally valid, but actually that helps to try and bring clubs on board with saying, actually, this is something we really need to focus on. And actually it's not that we can afford to do it, we can't afford to do it, it's we can afford not to do it.
If I can come to you on that, Bex, because I think given you've been in that bubble, have you noticed a difference between how maybe a perceived bigger club approaches player care to perhaps a smaller club would do? Is there a difference in approach?
I would say it's probably less the size of the club, but maybe, I mean, definitely investment has a role to play. So I think that if there's extra, money and resources around, then that does tend to go back towards the players. I think, especially in the women's game, resources tend to be stretched across clubs more generally, unless you do play at some of the top clubs in the world, like a Wolfsburg or Chelsea or the Manchester clubs. And I think that's where, the first things to get cut are things like player care, and things like, that the men get, when you can look at, in a week's time, if they're out for injury, you can actually quantify how much money that's costing a club. And then when you look at like the women, and that amount is so much less because their salaries are so much less, it's kind of like, well, it's a little bit less important, right? So that's where, like, working with Zone 7, for example, the guys that I work with, their AI early detection company, early detection of injury. It's so fascinating because it's like, well, of course you should want to keep your players on the pitch, and you should invest in trying to do that however you want to do it with your medical. But in the women's game, because there's just less money and less risk therefore involved in it, it just sort of tends to get overlooked, which is, I think, just wrong. And they probably need it even more than others because they don't have that post-career transition to go to, and that massive buffer because they have a lot more money saved up. So they really have to transition into something much quicker and figure that out during their career. And that support has to be there. Yeah, it's really important.
And when you're at a club, are the players talking about it? I mean, what is good player care to you? What does it look like? Is it going into work and someone's organised your diary for you for that day, or does it go deeper and way beyond that?
Yeah, I actually think, this is super controversial, but I think some of the academies, like, sorry guys, but some of the academies, you guys are not two of them, but they don't take care of players because, like Nyall was referring to, they push them just to play football, and that's their main focus. And what you're actually doing is creating a human being that then, when they fall out of the system, which happens to 99.99% of those players on the male side especially, they then don't know how to, manage their finances. They don't know how to cook. They don't know how to clean. And obviously I'm generalizing, but I do think that, that support to build them as human beings has to be there. So I think, yeah, sometimes we say that academies are a positive thing, but actually I think that there's a lot of like downside to not having them, learning to become normal human beings and integrate into society because they've just been focused on football. So I definitely think that, yeah, it totally depends on sort of where you are and what it looks like. But I think you have to look at the player as a person first. So the mental health that Miriam mentions, the injury, when you do get injured, how are you coming back? Or do you have a proper rehab schedule? I mean, I can't tell you what I went through at Wolfsburg, where I was basically on my own at the world's best club at the time. I mean, we won Champions League that year, and to have to go through that, like mentally and physically, but then also things like financial, understanding, looking at your post-career, what kind of education do you need, in addition to, playing in a team and being part of a football club. So there's so many aspects, but it's just like you and I, like, why do we not teach footballers? Why do we think that they're immune to having to become normal, well sort of respected human beings? So
what's your take on that, Nyall? Because covering Southampton Football Club, they've obviously got a very famous academy. I'm very close with a former coach there, and he says my biggest responsibility was developing good people. Of course, I want good players, but I want them to be good people first. Was that the experience that you found, or was it, no, Nyall, you're going to be a good player first, and then we'll worry about you being a good person second?
Again, it all reaches back to, players are commodities when they get to the academy, and it's a commodification process. What they want to do, they want to get one player to, the unfortunate thing is when you've got a cohort of about 12 guys, or, 12 players at an academy, only one or two are actually destined to make it, and the coaches and the clubs know that. So what they do, they tend to just push everyone in the same way they've got to give everyone, it seems, the same type of, room to develop. But what happens is, at the end of the day, they need to produce that player that's going to go to the first team and, produce a result for the club, or they're going to sell them on, especially at the lower end level, they're going to sell them on to make a profit for the club. So you've kind of got this, I'd say, this trade-off here where, you know, are we looking to develop 12 good players that may leave here and, you know, one might become a plumber, one might go to, you know, do their, you know, go get a degree and whatnot, or do we go and get, you know, one player here who's gonna, you know, we're gonna flog for 30 million pounds, or he's gonna get into the first team and score goals. So that's where they kind of in between the two. It depends on the level of a club. You know, I say the higher level clubs, they're probably a bit better because they're not as I say desperate to make money or to produce, you know, players on that conveyor belt. However, when you get down to a lower club, what you find is that a lot of clubs, they need to produce players to get them through to the, you know, to make the profit of the sale. So again, are they going to invest, you know, a little bit of chunk of money now to help education and player care? They're probably not. But if they can just play a coach that will hopefully bring them through and get them to the first team so they can sell them, that's probably what they're going to do. So, but, you know, in the cold, hard light of day, I definitely would believe that, you know, they don't really see it as, you know, education an important thing. So let's push the, you know, get a player.
And Miriam, from the research you are doing, when you're speaking to these kids, teenagers coming out of academies, essentially, what are they saying they hope to do? Now football's no longer an option. What are the broad range of, you know, vocations they actually want to explore? Are they limited? Is it too late for them to kind of get on with their life and explore something else, or do they get stuck in that mindset of, no, I will be a footballer, I will be a footballer?
Yeah, I guess a lot of people actually I've spoken to didn't have a plan B. I guess they weren't encouraged to have a plan B. So then I kind of stuck wondering what to do. I spoke to one player who was literally bouncing around from different academies. So he maybe spent like 6 months in one part of the UK and 2 weeks in another, and he was bouncing around for like 2 years. I think people, I guess they're just kind of ensuring if they don't have a plan B, they can't really go to anything. So that drop from the academy, that they're just not really caught by anyone. And we did a piece last year with Nyall actually, who spoke about the drop and how actually for a lot of Black and minority ethnic kids, it's even worse because in school they're kind of pigeonholed towards doing football, or if they want to be a rapper, things like that, because that is seen as like the successful route for a Black teenager. So when they particularly are being dropped from these academies, they really are like, you know, they have nothing to fall back on. And I think that's something we don't often talk about, because obviously we see the successful Black players in the Premier League, and you don't think about the millions of others. I think it's of the 1.5 million players who play organised youth footballs, it's maybe like less than 200 that make it to the Premier League. So yeah, I think there's not a lot some people can do when they are dropped and they don't have a plan B. So they're just going to keep trying, basically.
And Hugo, is there an argument that perhaps clubs could be doing more? So when, for example, if a player at Southampton gets dropped at 16 years old, I just use Southampton as an example because I cover them, but is there an argument that they could perhaps do more at that level and provide perhaps some sort of care for the next year and a half, just to provide education, support, or should it be cold-hearted and just look, sorry, thank you for your service, but you just weren't good enough?
No, I definitely don't think it should be the latter. I think Southampton specifically, from when I worked there, they were really good at basically finding people some sort of option. So, and I worked with the under-18s as an intern before I started with the first team. And, you know, from that class, we had 2 that went to play in America at university. We had a number who dropped down the leagues. We've had a number who've made it into the first team and now, you know, play for England or play for other clubs. But we also had a guy who started his own recruitment firm, you know, in medical recruitment. And so it was fascinating to see Southampton really made that effort to go and place them somewhere. And, you know, I think because it is club dependent, you get clubs that are good at it. Southampton's definitely one of them. You get clubs that are not so good at it. But I think that's what the Premier League are trying to do with the EPPP, which is the rules that govern academies, is try and you know, for the last season was the first season where they had to have mandatory player care, full-time player care role in the Category 1 academies. So there are steps being taken. There are life skills. There are encouragement. Everyone has to do education as a scholar. And so guys are encouraged to do other careers. Of course, they want to be footballers. I think the harder thing really is the identity piece, where when you are 15, 16, you're coming to the academy and everyone knows you from your town as that kid who plays for West Ham or plays for Southampton, and then suddenly you're not anymore. It's quite tough to go back to your friends and be, oh, I'm not a footballer anymore. And we see the peer pressure is really tough for them to have a fancy watch, a fancy car, and the new phone, and actually they're earning pretty little, very little money as a scholar. And so, but the peer pressure on them is really tough. So, can there more be done? 100%. Of course, more can be done, but there are definitely clubs doing the right things. There are definitely clubs doing not so much. But I think, between the clubs, the Premier League, the PFA, and also the agents as well, and the parents, is trying to get everyone together to, try and close all the gaps and come up with different options and support them as much as possible. And a lot of people, even off their own back, the staff will stay in touch. I've stayed in touch with a lot of the players, not because I have to, it's my job, because I'm interested and I care about them as people. So you don't get many sort of cold-hearted people in academies, I would say.
And if we can kind of move on to sort of transitioning out of football now, Rebecca, how did you find that support when you retired? Was it a case of you woke up on Monday morning and you're thinking, oh my, now what? Or is it, is it all planned out and you just move on?
Yeah, goodness, I'm glad it wasn't that case. Just two comments that actually answer that question. Miriam had a really good point. She was talking about like the dual career. And I think just to give like a little bit insight on the women's side, I think that happens less because women that go in, or girls that go into football, they don't have that same expectation that I could potentially be a multimillionaire, which nowadays you actually can as a female athlete as well, but it's even lower than the 0.00001% of the guys that make it. So I think that there's a little bit less of that stigma that also Hugo mentions. The show your bling peer pressure isn't really in the women's game. So there's sort of, I see that as a positive because you always know that you're having to plan for your post career. And so that's kind of my journey. That was my journey as well. And I'm not saying that every female player does, they certainly don't, but I think that it happens a lot more, and like probably 80% of the players that I work with in my company that they are looking at their post-career. And so that's what I did too. I did an undergrad in economics and Spanish, I did an MBA in business, and then I did a postgrad in psychology as well. But then I worked sort of every club that I was at, I was working like in a hydraulic cylinder manufacturing plant in Sweden, and just trying to get some experience and figure out what I really wanted to do. But so I could transition afterwards. But I think you still, no matter what, you go through that. I'm not a footballer anymore. And that loss of identity is something that you have to manage during your career. And to Miriam's point, there has to be that sort of mental health support there during your career so that you're prepared and you're ready. You're happily stepping out of your football career into a new, exciting chapter of your life. And that just happens so rarely, I think, right now, unless they have, a really good family, or I don't know, a job set up, or a very clear career path, like Jill Scott, for example, who's player coach at Man City. Obviously she's loaned out at Everton now, but she knows she wants to transition right into that. So, but again, it's so rare. So I do think that transition can be very scary. It's definitely wrapped up in identity, and there certainly needs to be planning for that during your height of your football career.
Did you feel as though you lost a part of your identity, Nyall?
Well, yeah, I feel like I lost all of me. I was so heavily identified with being a footballer, and from a young age, I thought, this is what I was going to be. Your whole family tell you that you're going to be able to buy your family a nice house, a nice car, and even from the school, when you're in school, you're the best in your PE class. You're getting picked in the playground first when it's lunchtime for the game. So everyone identifies. You identify heavily with being a footballer. And, the second it's taken away from you, it's almost like, what do I do now? I call it the non-athletic identity. It's not strengthened at all. So even though you're performing on the pitch and, you'll know how to handle the trials and tribulations that may come with football, there's trials and tribulations that happen outside of the bubble when you're playing. You still believe that you're going to make it. You still believe that, little things are going to get done for you. Like even having your kit washed by, the kit man at a club. It's something that you just, you're used to. And, the adulation that, even when you're around your peers and they're looking at you and asking you, how's it going? When you don't have that anymore, it's quite difficult to take. And, even myself, I went through a journey where I didn't have a clue what I was going to do next. Like, luckily, I was able to get, some sort of qualification whilst at the academy. But I had no idea of what was to come next. And, I had to work, had to find different jobs. And then, I went and done my undergrad degree. And then that kind of led me to do my master's degree to research what was happening. How come there's such a drop off when it comes to, young black males in football? But, it was for everyone as well. But my master's was done just from my perspective. And that led me to do my PhD now, where I'm looking at, what more can be done at the academy after a long career, because unfortunately not everyone's going to be as fortunate, as good a player as Rebecca to, go throughout, a whole career and retire at the end with an olive branch, like I say, like the gladiators of ancient Rome. Some of us will get dropped out pretty quickly, and it's about how we're going to sort that out then and then,
Yeah. Daniel, can I jump in there? Because Nyall, I had a similar situation. I had a scholarship from the high performance guys at New Zealand for being an elite athlete. And so I was doing my psych degree given a scholarship. When I got injured and I had to stop playing, which wasn't my choice, but I got injured, they basically said, okay, your scholarship's done. And arguably that's exactly when you need more support, because I couldn't finish my degree unless I paid for it. And it was like, wait, so the theory of like helping and supporting players sometimes doesn't match the reality of what they actually need. Anyway, it was just
it doesn't match
very
at all. It doesn't
frustrating at
marry
the
up.
time. Yeah.
I can imagine, it's the most frustrating thing. And you do feel like, the rug's been pulled under your feet, because they want you there and everyone loves you. And then the second that is gone, it's kind of like, and how do you adjust to that? Especially when no one around you to talk to you about it. It's just, you feel like you're lost.
And Nyall, are you going into academies and offering advice and speaking to these kids, or is that not a football club's not trying to do that because they want to try and sell the message that these kids are still going to be professional footballers?
You see, like, the thing is, I've got to say, at the academy level, there's so much. Everyone wants to improve the young lads because they know, you've got a 16-year-old up to 18-year-old, they know the harsh realities of life. All the coaches, everyone at the club, they know that they're looking at these guys' eyes and they know not all of you are going to make it, unfortunately. But but it's difficult to say that when they're at the academy and you're paid to actually get them to a place whereby they should be performing for the first team or, being sold for a profit. So you come in, I've got like a few initiatives guiding me players in different, areas of teaser, camera, editing, shooting content and whatnot. But what you tend to find is that there is no budget when you get to the academy level. It's literally as tight as anything. So at the top, you're seeing, these astronomical figures for player wages, agent fees, transfer fees. But the second you get to the academy level, they're happy for you to come into the academy level and do any kind of initiative. But the second it costs, it seems like it's going to be a bit of an impossibility.
And Miriam, from a kind of journalist perspective, should we as the media be shining more of a light on this? We're always, especially in my role, maybe not so much at the Athletic now, but we're always interested in the next big thing and putting so much pressure on a 15-year-old that's going to be the next Cristiano Ronaldo, when in reality he's not even sat his GCSEs yet. Could we be doing more to perhaps shine a light on some of the difficulties that these teenagers do face on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been an interesting few months for this subject because there was a player who was at City Academy who committed suicide recently, and I think there was another player last month. And obviously, you can't just make links between football and just the academies. It could be a new, numerous things. But I think the media actually just aren't good enough at talking about academies, and that could be because of kind of financial pressure. And obviously when you write online you have to think about like hits and what gets the most hits. But I do genuinely feel like from a journalist perspective, we know that we could be kind of investing in our future if we've made relationships with these players and then in 10 years that's the next Messi, then it just makes sense. So I think from that perspective we could do more to help them also become part of that world, and if they are going to make the first team and if they do become footballers professionally, like they also need to get used to the media. So it's kind of win-win for everyone. And I think as well, like yesterday there was a Sky Sports News article published about Max Noble from Fulham, who talked about his period at the academy, and it feels like a lot of the time it makes the news when it's a really bleak story and it's a bit, you know, it's hard hitting and it's about a suicide or someone who's had abuse. And I think it always it comes as a shock to a lot of people who aren't really aware of those things going on. And I think if we actually tell like the really positive stories as well, because there are a lot of positive stories, it needs to balance out a bit basically. And I think, yeah, we definitely don't do enough, but it feels like, I guess the more the media becomes interested in attracting kind of younger audiences, which I think most media companies are, it feels like something that should come with that, and I really hope it does.
To go to the other extreme, Hugo, where you've worked at the top end in the Premier League, everyone knows the kinds of salaries that Premier League footballers get paid, and they earn all of this money, and they have nothing to worry about when they retire at 35 because they're multimillionaires. Is it always as simple as that, or is it actually quite difficult for these players?
They might not have the same financial pressures as everyone else, but I think, you know, the loss of identity, I think, for a top Premier League player is probably even worse, because publicly everyone knows. I mean, I've worked with a number of managers who have been fired, and actually to see them the day before they were fired at the club, that, you know, they stand tall, they're strong at that, and then the next day you go around to their house to help them with something because they've been fired, and they're just small and they just look like 3 inches shorter. And I think, you know, it's bad enough when anyone gets fired, but when you get fired publicly as a manager, the whole world is judging you. It's making decisions on you. People are driving past you and being like, yeah, he should have got fired. You know, most of us don't have that issue. And I think the problem is that we find is that players motivate, and this sounds like a very first world problem, but our players have such a problem with motivation where if you're earning 80 to 100 grand a week, and then the job you actually can get out of football is 30 grand a year, you're thinking, well, why am I going to bother on this? So we try and find things that are actually going to keep the guys interested. So we've run some like property investment courses, we've done media courses, we've done sports marketing courses, we've done, you know, even looking at like this sports directorship. I think Eni Luco has done that and gone to be director of football at Aston Villa Women's. And so trying to point them to things that are actually going to hold their interest, keep them mentally active, and also give themselves that non-footballing identity that Nyall spoke about, it is really important. And yeah, if they have good management of their finances, then yeah, they should have no problems financially. But a lot of them have a number of mortgages. They have mum's house to pay for, dad's house to pay for, brother, sister, everything like that. And so if everything isn't paid off by the time they're retired, they actually get into quite a large financial difficulty quite quickly. So again, trying to put that financial management in place for them before they retire is vital.
You're all going to be absolutely thrilled to know we are getting some questions sent to us. So that there are people watching. The first one I want to throw out to all of you really, and whoever feels most confident answering it, then please do. But so the question comes in and it's, how can we guarantee a duty of care to the lower leagues of the game? Is this going to take investment from the top leagues? I don't know who wants to jump in on that one.
Nobody.
I mean, I can answer that. I think it should. I mean, having worked at FIFA and seen the amount of money that comes in those doors and seeing what they spend it on, I think that if you look at the ecosystem of football and how much money it spins off globally, what is it all centralized on? Players. And they're human beings. So for me, it's a responsibility from the very, very top that investment needs to go in at that level of the player care. So I definitely think it should come from FIFA. It should be followed up by confederations. It should be followed up by federations, by clubs. And I don't necessarily think that the big clubs should be supporting the smaller clubs necessarily, but I do think that there should be funding like given to each of those, all of the clubs for player care, because it's really sad to have seen a lot of male players that were at the top of their game, and Hugo, as Hugo mentions, hit financial ruin within 3 years of their retirement, and, you know, walk through the doors of FIFA and you're like, oh my God, it's so-and-so. And the guy's poor. Like, the guy has no money. And that's such a detriment to the sport long-term, whether it's a male or a female. So I think it's in the best interest of everybody, but certainly those that have the most money in football, that they need to be the ones investing in player care.
Do you think that's realistic, Hugo? You've worked at Premier League clubs. Do you think that's a realistic ambition to have someone like a Southampton or a West Ham funneling money down?
No, I would agree with Bex. I don't think it's the jobs of the bigger clubs. I think that's probably a PFA area, and I think that's probably where they would say that they do provide that care. How effective they are, you'd have to ask players at that level. But I think, I don't think it's West Ham writing a check to Dulwich Hamlet. I think that would be bizarre. I think it needs to be something where it's, the PFA and probably the FA, but the PFA probably the best place to do that. I think the PFA just needs to be a bit more proactive and a bit stronger. And I think, certainly our players at West Ham and at Southampton didn't hear a whole lot from the PFA unless there was something that they needed from them for various voting initiatives or whatever. So, certainly I didn't really feel that the PFA gave a huge amount of help day to day with the player care. But from what I understand from the players who play lower down the pyramid, they are more relevant and more helpful, which is fantastic to hear.
If I can move on to the second question, and this one I want to go to you, Miriam, because I know you're doing a lot of work on it. So the question comes in and it's, what place does discrimination have in player care? Now, I know you've touched on it earlier, but now maybe a good opportunity to go even deeper into some of the research you've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so I did quite a big project on racism in football this year where I think basically as sports journalists, we kind of so often talk about racism in football as kind of isolated incidents. So that might be fans shouting abuse at players or someone throwing a banana or just some of the horrific abuse that goes on daily. And then the next day you spend like a day kind of on the news mill with it, and it's just like a 24-hour thing. And actually it's so rare that we really think about the problem and where it's coming from and why it's such a huge problem in football and not as much explicitly in other sports. But equally, we never really seem to just stop and pause and think, wait a minute, how is that affecting that person? We know it's so ridiculous that players kind of go to do their jobs as footballers and expect to be racially abused a lot of the time. And now that fans aren't in stadiums, it's just happening online, and it's getting worse and worse online. We've seen in the past couple of weeks how kind of bad it's become. So yeah, I think discrimination has we don't. I don't know, Hugo will probably be able to talk more about this, but I feel like there's not a lot done to actually make sure players are okay after that. And if you've suffered racist abuse, I have, and it actually put me off going to football stadiums from the age of 5. My dad he used to work as a scout for Sheffield United, and I heard someone say something racist to him when I was 5 and just kind of decided football wasn't for me. And now I only go to women's games because there's not a lot of that goes on there. And I think no one stops and says, wait, what's going on there? I don't know what it is like in clubs, like I said, but just even to talk about the effects of it and the coping mechanisms that players have that we did this year in a big racism project for the BBC, people were saying, I've never been asked that before. I asked Emil Heskey how he coped with it, and he was like, no one's ever asked me that. And I was like, but you're Emil Heskey, why? So yeah, I just think it's not spoken about. I know it's a difficult thing to talk about and to deal with, especially when we don't have an answer to the problem of racism in football. But I just feel passionately about the fact that we need to ask people if they're okay after that.
Did you ever come across discrimination in a player care capacity in football, Nyall, or?
I wouldn't say player care really. The problem is it's a societal problem, so it's not so much in the clubs. Obviously there is, there you do have that discrimination due to unconscious bias, but in terms of more can definitely be done and more needs to be done in terms of just helping people cope with the trauma of being racially abused, whether that be online or whether that be in the stands. I've had my fair share of racial abuse, and like Miriam said, no one's ever asked me, how did it make you feel? How did you cope with it? It's kind of like you just suck it up, get on with it, and just crack on.
And if I can move on to the next question, and these probably go to Hugo and Rebecca. So if I start with you, Rebecca, can a good reputation for player care at a club be the key reason a player chooses to sign for that club? players talk, don't they? It's a small world.
Yeah, it's a small world. I mean, definitely in the women's game, it's a really small world. There aren't that many top clubs globally, and which clubs are going to take care of you and which ones aren't, and it definitely makes a difference. You may sometimes learn a little bit too late after you've signed, but you're going to leave that club pretty quickly, and you're going to see the retention rate of those clubs go down. So yeah, I definitely think it makes a big difference. And for me personally, I went and played in Sweden. I was in the northern part of Sweden in Skellefteå, and it's dark, I mean, we had daylight 3 hours of the day in the winter, and I did a rehab there and stayed during the winter. But I just loved the team. It felt like a family. I was really well taken care of. We were like anywhere between, I don't know, third and sixth in the league, but it was kind of that wasn't as important to me as feeling like it was a place that I could call home and I could learn other things. And I was growing so much as a person. So that, and then I went on to go to Wolfsburg and we won Champions League. But my time in this Swedish club was much more beneficial to me now than it ever was at Wolfsburg for so many reasons. So definitely matters. And again, that's what I'm saying is it's actually in the best interest of all the stakeholders in football to take care of players. They think they get away with it, but they don't. And if they do, it's only for a short amount of time. It's always going to catch up to you.
And Hugo, I know, given the work you did at Southampton, how highly the players thought of you there. So when you went to West Ham, I'm sure there was a case that the West Ham players would have been reaching out to the Southampton players, international teammates. They probably knew you before you arrived. Is that something that you saw?
Yeah, it was spooky. It was really spooky. That they kind of like, I went to introduce myself. They're like, oh yeah, I know who you are. And they kind of check me out. And I think that's football for you. Everyone speaks to everyone. And I can't say it's the most important factor, but certainly we try and build ambassadors who leave Southampton, West Ham, whichever club I'm working at, where they want to go and say, yeah, go. If someone calls them, is West Ham good? Yeah, it's great. And I think, that's what the Swedish team built with Bex is, if anyone called her about that team, she'd say, yeah, 100% go there. And that's from someone they trust. It's easier than any, it's easier probably to give them even a lower salary because they like, I want to go there. But obviously if you were talking about two massively different clubs, it doesn't change it massively. But in terms of actually building the department and showing what you can do as a club, it just shows a level of compassion, a level of organization, and that level of caring that's really, really important.
And if I could just get a really quick kind of 15-20 second answer from this, Hugo, given it's the role you're doing now, is there a base standard at football clubs for player care, or is there a lot of work to be leveling it all out?
No, not in the first teams at all. There's no regulation at all. I mean, you've got two clubs in the Premier League with nothing at all, and you've got one club with 12 full-time people. So massive disparity and a lot more that can be done. Which
is brilliant for you because it's going to keep you in a job and keep you busy for the rest of the year.
Great plug there, well done.
Look, that's all we've got time for this evening. So again, thank you to the 4 brilliant panelists, and hopefully you're all still watching. And yeah, thank you for your time. Back to the studio.